Well, Ciarra, welcome to Masala Chai Theology. It is so great to have you here.
Oh man, I'm so excited. I had a chance to meet Father Joash a few months ago, but to be here together in this amazing space you've curated is just such a gift. So thanks for having me.
Goes both ways. I have learned so much from you in the short time we've been friends. You keep teaching me so much, and I think from our first meeting, I was just like, I have to introduce you to my community because you are awesome and more people need to know about you. And a lot of people already know about you, but we all could use more friends and supporters and paid subscribers and that kind of thing. So or free
Specifically paid
subscribers.
subscribers. So hit that button. No, actually, well, Father Joash was teasing me because the first time we met, I called him like three different names that were not his name. So we had a journey to getting here, but I'm glad I
That's
have it
right.
down now.
That's right. I and Sarah is being very kind. I purposefully let her call me Joas, um, maybe about
Joaz
three
is kind of a
times.
vibe. Yeah, I was calling him Joaz. I was like saying it like just riffing with my guy, and like everyone around me was like, "Who is she talking to? Who is this woman?" Now I'm thinking I'm talking to my friend Joaz, but I wasn't. So oh,
Well,
that's another man.
yeah. Yeah, I had some colleagues I worked with in Atlanta back when I was a new immigrant to the States, and I live in Canada now, as you know, but
Mhm.
I had some colleagues in Atlanta who'd just be like, "Joash, sit your ass down." It was amazing. It was
Your name. There's a lot. There's a few jokes you can make in there. So
There you go. There you go. Yeah, yeah, and, Sarah, you're just, the honestly, like, the coolest theologian I know. You just have this really cool aura, vibe to you, whatever Gen Z call it these days, but, beyond even just all the depth of wisdom and knowledge, that you teach, on ecotheology and all kinds of public theology, on your scholarship, and you're so accomplished. I will totally butcher an introduction of you, so I
please
will let
butcher.
you
Oh, okay.
uh, no,
Yeah,
I'll say
I can
this,
totally. Yeah.
don't hide the fact that you went to Harvard, and that you're super duper smart and you're presenting at, scholarly theologian summits out in Europe, with an international audience. So don't, bring your full self here,
Mm.
and don't feel the need to underplay all that. But tell us a little bit about yourself and your story and how you got to doing what you're doing as the gardening theologian.
Oh, that was already so kind, too kind. I really appreciate that. And, I think like so many people, I came to the work of like progressive inclusive theology because of my own embodied experience growing up in the church. I grew up Pentecostal Assemblies of God. So I don't know if
Mm,
any of you in the chat grew up Pentecostal in particular, but Pentecostal is based upon the idea of like Pentecost, kind of when the Holy Spirit came to people within biblical text, and how the Holy Spirit manifested itself through charismatic engagement with the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues, which not every denomination believes in. The Pentecostals do believe that when the Holy Spirit comes over you, that you can speak a different language, falling out under the Holy Spirit. A lot of which is like when someone prays over you and maybe you feel overcome and you faint or you fall out. All these different things. So my church was but it also was very big on relational theology, having an individual relationship with God. So
mm.
Pentecostals often feel like throughout the day they're hearing God speak to them, that they're in this kind of constant dialogue with God. And I think there can be a lot of beauty to that, like something that I always felt growing up in church. Like it was so cool to see someone come into service, and went to a mega church, but to see people come in and maybe you see their shoulders are a little down, or they look a little dejected, and they leave with this whole new air of compassion and self love. You can see these beautiful moments of transcendence and transformation in the church. But I also was a Black queer woman in a very white centric theology. My church was diverse. I think that's important to highlight that many churches that are white theologically don't have a white congregation itself, right? Like white theology does not mean it's only white people in the pews or white pastors speaking. When I think about white theology, I think about theologies maybe that are a little bit disembodied. By that I mean,
Mm.
Pentecostals love the joy of convening with God. They're not so good at navigating grief or transformation in our lives because those things feel challenging. Pentecostals do believe that God gives us partnership and love, but they don't believe in sex outside of marriage. They don't believe that queer sex is okay. So you have these really bright moments that are also paired with theologies that I think can leave us disembodied and disconnected. So when I went to Berkeley for my undergraduate degrees, well, UC Berkeley, was the first time I kind of like had to confront my queerness in a real way because I had a crush on
Mm,
someone on my dormitory floor. So I would see her every day, and I had to kind of really think about my sexuality. I also was the first time I really had to interact with people with different faith backgrounds, different class backgrounds, different perspectives. And it was kind of this place where all of my theologies fell apart. Like Berkeley is where everything I believed theologically died. But it also was a place that actually, let me pause there. But I'll say, like, that's just like the first part of my journey is, this kind of place where I was Pentecostal and then, or grew up Pentecostal and then at Berkeley having this or this deconstructing experience. And then I ended up going to Harvard for my master's in theology. And the central question in my personal statement at Harvard was, do Black queer people have something to say about God? Because I think
mm,
something that I want to highlight is people message me all the time or comment all the time, and they're like, you have your degree in American Studies from Berkeley, you have your master's in divinity from Harvard, and you have all these critiques about white patriarchal heterosexist God. Why do you serve God at all? Why do you worship at all?
mm,
Why do you come back to prayer at all? And I say, well, I left one definition of faith. I didn't leave God. And to say that leaving that definition of faith is to leave God is to relinquish God to the powerful. Is to say God can only be defined by those who have privilege. And I don't believe that at all. So I like to highlight in my own story that I was able to leave one construct of God, but I found a whole nother one, which is why I think I love ecotheology. It's that rebirth and that tending. So that's just a bit about me. Berkeley,
wow.
Harvard, and kind of a little story of my transformation too.
Oh my goodness. I
Yeah.
love that so much. Really, two questions come to mind for me. And I mean, I'm processing this as
Mhm.
someone who also comes from shocker to a lot of people. And I don't know if I've shared this with you either, but I'm a fifth generation Pentecostal on my dad's side. So
I think you mentioned that, but I have.
okay.
Please tell me all about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I call myself a Pentecostal priest, and I'm in a diocese with others who come from Pentecostal backgrounds who found beauty in the ancient traditions of the
Mm.
church, the liturgy, the ancient wisdom that we tend to discard in the modern world. And among that core is this idea of not just justice, but also ecological justice, right? So I'm thinking Pope Francis, Laudato Si, his encyclical on protecting the environment and the way he ties in colonialism into that. Like, there's so much beauty in these ancient sacramental traditions that I was kept from in my Pentecostal heritage, which was all about the spiritual.
Yeah. Was it
And
similar to mine, like the very charismatic and?
yeah, so I don't know how it would compare. So like my ancestors have been Christian for 2,000 years, and then late 1800s, early 1900s, you have a Pentecostal revival among that community, and there's some good things that come from it, like the inclusion of lower caste folks for the first time in the sacramental life of the church,
Mm.
but with that was also an aspect of colonialism, of imagination, because even though our Pentecostal movement was an indigenous one, um, fairly charismatic, not probably not as super charismatic as some of the black traditions that I've come across, but probably more Assemblies of God than
Mm.
so the service is orderly, but then you have that one meeting once a week that you can let loose,
Yeah.
um, where people typically bring their unprocessed stuff that they should probably process in therapy too, to your point, you know
Oh yeah.
we like, it's so fascinating. I've been thinking of that connection too lately, but anyway,
Oh, we can get in that.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm really curious from your perspective. I guess the first question I'll ask you is, um, since you did explore this theologically at Harvard Divinity, um, how do you experience Creator God? I know this is a massive question. How
Oh
do you
no.
teach us? How do you experience
Yes.
Creator God through your unique Black queer eyes?
Oh my gosh, I love that. So right now, actually, I wrote a Substack like a month and a half ago called like for church girls who considered suicide when the Bible isn't enough. And like
Mm,
trigger warning, but I'm not going to go too much into suicidality. But I do think there's such a connection between um For me, Pentecostal theology and, mental health concerns, truly, like, as I mentioned, like, growing up Pentecostal, I knew how to I only knew oh, what's up, Cass? My friend Cass is in here. What up, Cass? But I knew how to praise like, actually, I'm reading right now Prophetic Lament, by Soong
Mm,
Chan Ra. Highly recommend it, and something he talks about is how so many of our fundamentalist churches are stuck in a theology of celebration. Like,
mm,
for example, even I remember, like, when I was an athlete in high school, and I would tell my pastors I'm injured, and immediately it's praying for healing. Immediately it's, could I have done anything that could have led to that injury by not being as pious as I need to? Or is God trying to teach me a lesson through this failing? And so it's always about a lesson through our pain or celebration and bypassing of the pain, but not just sitting in like, man, I'm injured and like, how does that feel in my body? And like, how can I still be with this injured body and love this injured body? And how can I honor that actually like our bodies all experience impermanence and change? And something my friend Connie Chin says, who's a great theologian, is disability as open enrollment. We all throughout our lives actually move in and out of disability status. My church believes only in praying for healing, and it saw any kind of ailment as a sign of someone's spiritual failure. So imagine being 15 or 16 or 17 and carrying these theologies. Over
mm,
time, you start to see kind of your core self as bad, and the theology becomes about almost outpacing our humanity. How can I pray enough to not be human? How can I be pious enough to not be human? Because the flesh is bad and the body is bad. And so I think, one of the biggest ways that Black queer theology and queer theology teach us embodiment is to get out of a kind of a perfectionistic way of being. And something that Pamela Lightsey says in her work is, and she wrote Our Lives Matter, a queer womanist theology. Something she says in her work is, for the white church, God is like only textual, but for queer folks, God is experiential.
mm,
And one of the first like real, I feel like embodied experiences I had with God was when I was at Berkeley. And it's funny, that means I'm not saying that in the Pentecostal church I didn't have embodied experiences with God, but I think the first time I had a decolonial embodied
mm,
experience with God, I was at Berkeley. As I mentioned, I was in love with a girl on my dormitory floor. So every day I'm seeing what my church would call like a stumbling block. This person, I'm seeing this person that wants to get me off track with Jesus. And I remember like going to a Catholic church that actually was queer affirming, and it was empty. Like I love Catholic churches where you can just walk in and pray. I just love that. And so I just was at the altar, trying to pray my queerness away. And the way I describe it is I just feel like God threw it back. Like that's how I feel. Like I feel like I just was like, take this thing. I can't, that's not a textual experience, it's an embodied experience, but it was the first time I felt like I am trying to do everything the church is asking me to do. And I think there's a still small voice asking me to live differently, to exist differently. And so, one thing I would say is one way that womanist theologians and queer theologians teach us to know God is to go into our own bodies, is to return to our own intuition. So much of the Pentecostal church, for example, I learned that hip hop is demonic. I learned so much about, which like also frame my blackness as something bad, in my opinion. I learned that as a woman, my job was to like hide my sexuality, my body, so I don't harm men. And I learned as a queer person to pray myself away too. And so much of returning to God was also returning to myself. And the other thing I'll say is, in God as a Black woman, Christina Cleveland talks so much about patriarchal God, about Father Sky God, about this God that looms above us in judgment. That's the God that's judging my queerness. That's the God that's judging my sexuality. That's the God that's judging my blackness. But she talks about Black Mother God being the woman who loves our hot mess. And I think actually so much of returning to God is also returning to the complexity of ourselves, as I mentioned. Like, I am a person who is kind and optimistic. I also get angry. I also have rage. Those things are all a part of God. So I'd say, like, the one thing that queer womanists teach us is that returning to God is returning to integrated self. It's not about dying to a bad self. It's about knowing all of ourselves. Buddhism talks about this kind of self-aversion, which I think is the same thing as dying to the flesh. But what Buddhism says is we need to work on our self-aversion. And it actually says the things that we hate about ourselves, that we hate our rage, or we hate that sometimes we lie, or like hating them doesn't make them die, it makes them amplify. I think in Pentecostalism, I started to focus on the worst parts of myself. I'd focus on my lying, or I'd focus on whatever because I'm trying to kill it. I'm so focused on it. But Buddhism says, like, let's integrate all parts of ourselves. Queer womanist theology says, let's integrate. So I'd say the first ways we start with feeling God in our body is asking ourselves, what part of myself was I told to kill to know more of God? And can that part actually contain parts of God? Can my rage know parts of God? Can my grief know parts of God? Can my anger know parts of God? I think it's about integration. I think that's how we start the process.
Oof, that is a whole word. And yeah, I resonate with that so deeply. I could show you a picture of myself from a decade ago working in Georgia Republican politics, clean shaven, sharp suits and ties, Krista, my partner, says I was probably cosplaying a white American gentleman at that point, a Southern white
I,
American gentleman.
as
I
a
mean,
as a as a masked lesbian, I've also maybe cosplayed a white American gentleman sometimes. So.
put that on the resume, put that on your
Yeah.
LinkedIn. And again, nothing wrong with being a
Yeah.
Southern white American gentleman. It's just not who I was created to be, right? But it's for but then like over the years, like I often do this in talks. I show a time lapse of how I start growing my hair out, my facial hair out, start dressing different, and then I become myself as a priest who shows up in his full unassimilated self. And something that you reminded me of that I say is unless we know who we are, we'll never know who we were created to be. And the work of justice is ultimately inviting the world to be who it was always created to be. So if we don't know who we are, we'll never know how to invite the world to be who it was created to be. And that's the work of justice. And yeah, does that resonate with
Yes.
your story? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, right now I'm actually reading, we'll find it, Black and Buddhist. I love Buddhism. Buddhism actually has been a big set of deconstruction for me, like my garden. And Black and Buddhist was co-written by Professor Cheryl Giles, and I had her class at Harvard.
Mm,
Amazing class, all about trauma-informed meditation. And it was just, oh my gosh, it was amazing. Like one thing I'll say at the beginning of Black and Buddhist is she talks about when we think about Black Buddhism, Buddhism has this idea, there's an eightfold path. And one of them is like right intention, right view, right like there's all these things around being right, but usually
mm,
it's flipping itself on its head. So she talks about how like right view in a colonial society might be feeling like we have the right perspective or all the authoritative knowledge, but right view in Buddhism is understanding that we never have the completely right view, that we have to always be open to changing our perspective and changing our perception. That's what having the right view is being always open to a new way of thinking and seeing the world. And she talks about right intention as well, which is an intention to treat others with compassion, but we have to first start with the self. When we have aversion to ourselves, we automatically treat other people poorly. If I, for example, I don't know, have social anxiety, maybe I'm more likely to be critical of how someone else is acting socially because I'm being critical of myself.
mm,
There are ways that Buddhism reminds us that the violence we do to ourselves, we also do through others. And we see that in the systems of inequality we create. These are systems that first, I think, begin in our own body. As I mentioned in Pentecostalism, when we're killing one part of ourself, it makes sense that we also might create policies and practices and norms that encourage people to kill other parts of themselves because we've
mm,
said this part of
mm.
ourself can't flourish. So why would I allow that part of you to flourish? And something
Wow.
that I think is interesting, I just do want to bring in gardening a bit here is I always say Harvard is where I did a bunch of cerebral deconstruction, asking,
Mm,
what am I losing serving a white supremacist God? And what do
mm,
I gain with an expansive idea of God? But in my garden is where I had the embodied lesson of who that God can actually be. And
mm,
in theology school, maybe I could play with the idea that God loves me when I'm imperfect. But my garden, for example, the first year I gardened, I kind of messed up everything you could ever do. Wrong soil, wrong manure, wrong plant food, everything wrong. And that thing still bloomed, and it taught me so much about God is not a God that requires perfection. It's actually just the process of showing up compassionately and with curiosity every day. I think that's the work of faith. And I think the work of faith is like being an imperfect gardener, just tilling the
mm.
soil every day with an open heart and an open soul. So I definitely can relate to that, just what you said around just kind of this yeah, this aversion to self and how that can create an aversion to others. I think systemic harm comes from self-aversive theology itself.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Um, you know, Something I'm thinking of, and this ties into my next question for you here, is um, empire is so good at dividing us from ourselves, from each other, and humankind from creation. And And it does this to divide and conquer, to steal our wealth and our resources, right? This is what empire did with my ancestors in
Mm,
southern India. But they divide us from the land. And the
mm,
work that you do, Ciarra, is so healing and restorative because you teach us new ways of having relationship with
mm,
the land. And yeah, and seeing creation as a sister, um, and not being afraid of it, right? So my next question for you is, I'm really curious, like, how did that come about for
mm,
you? Because and I'm wondering because like I grew up in a city of 20 million people in Mumbai, not a lot of access to green spaces, outdoors. Um, and the little access I had was there was a national park nearby, but understandably, there'd be dangerous tigers and leopards there that would make the news for eating human beings because we were encroaching on their territory, right? But so I was taught to fear creation. Made
mm.
it easier for me to then be assimilated into the American empire, to work Republican politics, to do harmful stuff for the environment. But and then I had this journey of decolonizing and learning to love the land. Even going on my first backcountry camping trip this past weekend and surviving it with so much fear.
Wow.
So
I wanna hear
I'd love,
about that. That's impressive.
yeah, we'll
I've
talk
never
about
done
that.
that. I'm a glamper, okay? I garden, but I'm a glamper, okay?
But tell us about this love for the outdoors, this reconciliation with creation and the land. How did that come about for you?
Oh, I love that question, and, they yeah, I do wanna hear about that camping too, but
We'll get to
we'll get to that, and, so one, like, gardening for me is very ancestral, like, my family, my grandfather's a gardener, so,
Wow.
I'm really lucky because my grandparents were my neighbors for, like, 20 years of my life. When my parents got divorced, we moved to Sacramento from this town in Northern California called Grass Valley. If anyone knows here about Grass Valley or Nevada City, it's a very small rural town. So I also always grew up around nature, and my mom loves nature. But my grandfather was an avid gardener, and he would talk a lot about growing up as a child of sharecroppers and having to learn. My grandparents are born in 1930s Louisiana, both farmers. My grandpa's one of 8 children, my grandma's one of 13 children. In fact, they're married and they have a brother and a sister who are married. So anyway, very
Mm,
small town. But my grandfather was drafted into the army at a southern university when he was 18, forced draft. I think we forget about forced drafts, but pulled out of college. And the thing that he brought with him from his family was gardening knowledge. So as a kid, I would go to my grandparents' house. I was so lucky. Like I would walk over there all the time, have the best food, and I would always say like I found God in my grandmother's kitchen and I found God in my grandfather's garden. And every time I'd walk into my grandfather's garden, the first thing he would say is like, "Ciarra, I'm so happy to see you. You are my friend." And in my work, I say that he introduced me to a God that is our friend. I in our churches so much we meet a God of judgment, a God that we want to come to the altar of every day to lament and say, "Make me whole and make me full." But my grandfather introduced me to a God that delights in us. I would come into his garden and he would tell me I'm his friend, and then he'd show me every single plant and how proud he was of the blooming of each plant. He would talk to his plant, he would nurture his plant. I feel like he was just like this really beautiful representation, I think, of how God sees us and tends to us with excitement and mutual nurturing and tenderness. And so he really introduced me to this God of the garden. But I didn't start, gardening until for myself until 2019, until COVID, 2020 basically. COVID, I was sent home from work. I was living up with my mom because my job was like on leave. And it's just something about being in the garden while there were Black Lives Matter protests were happening. It was just returning to the body, and it felt like everything I learned in theology school coming into my body. I learned in theology school that maybe there is a Black woman God, but in my garden, I got to meet that Black woman God who
mm,
is never judgmental, that always saw me with compassion the next day, that tended to me. And I think there's something about Black women in gardens. Alice Walker wrote In Search of Our Mother's Gardens that led to womanist theology itself. And something she says in her work, particularly in The Color Purple, is it pisses us off when we walk by the color purple and don't notice it because we're also missing a God that wants to please us back. We're missing a God that wants us to delight in that God too. And so I think in the garden, Christians learn that they don't just have to come to the altar of God and tear their clothes and lament, but that they can be in joyful connection with a God that is tending to them and they are tending back to. And I love the idea of tending to God because then God can also bloom into new things. And the God of the garden dies too. Because people tell me all the time, like, well, if God is not patriarchal, what is God? And I think the garden helps us to imagine new gods because in the garden, if we say our proverbial theologies are dying, that means our other new theologies are blooming. We're in a cycle with God. We're in this ongoing relationship. So it was my upbringing, but it also was womanist theology and it's centering on gardening and mothering that also brought me into like this garden God.
Mm, so good. My goodness. Yeah, and as you talk about taking, receiving, death, and resurrection in the garden, like I'm thinking of, I mean, we literally breathe out CO2, and the garden breathes in our CO2, and then the garden breathes out oxygen, and then
Yes.
we breathe in oxygen. We're so interconnected, right? Like, I mean, that's the oneness with creation, but what's like climate change, all of that destroys that. Empire destroys that. It's happening because of capitalism and empire, right? And so, which is
Yeah.
so tied to the history of colonialism. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I was gonna ask you actually, like, as a priest, what that looks like within like your theology now, because my church, my Pentecostal church definitely, diminished nature as a teacher for us, and also diminished our responsibility to nature. Like, it is our job, to take care of this earth, but my church definitely framed the earth as being here for us to pillage, and that comes into, like I think we forget that one of victims of colonial theology are plants. It's plant life. We usurp plant life, we kill plant life when we don't see it as a part of our bodies, a part of our theology. So I'm curious maybe how Episcopalian theology and Anglican theology thinks about plant life too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's uh there's definitely um an emphasis on creation and stewardship and things like that, but so much of my theology offends a lot of people. It offends St. Thomas Indian Christians. It offends because it's decolonized, right? And I'm
Yeah.
going to go further back into the things that our ancestors believed and held to.
Mm,
Not just my ancestors, yours, but also Celtic ancestors. Celtic, like white folks' ancestors.
mm.
They believed the stuff that
I love
empires
that
came.
post.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no,
post about that was
no,
great.
yeah, yeah. No, thanks for that. And I mean, the reality is, um, our ancestors held to beliefs about the land, about ecotheology, about seeing God in creation, communing, being at one with His creation, her creation, um, and those things were declared as heresy by the empires that showed up, and those
Mm,
theologies and that wisdom was written out of um, Christian orthodoxy as we understand it today. But scripture is still full of it,
mm.
Jesus being revealed in all of his creation. And that includes all people's religions, societies, cultures too, like you were talking about with Buddhism, right? And so
Yes.
so anyway, I think like I'm grateful for the things I've inherited and even the tradition I'm still in, but I also find myself often pushing the boundaries like you and trying to because that's the work of decolonization. It's the work of making ourselves and everyone else uncomfortable by going past the boundaries that empire enforces for us, even in our spiritualities. And I love so much your emphasis on you know, being connected with the land for you was a way for you to be connected with your ancestors, is what I
Mhm.
really saying there. Um, and that's so true for all our ancestors, like um, all our ancestors lived in agrarian societies before the modern era and were
Yes.
more connected to the lands until rich and powerful people came along and put systems in place to disconnect them from the land. Um, yeah, so I'm curious from your standpoint, what does liberation look like
Ooh.
for us? Um, and how do we pursue liberation um towards oneness with the garden and oneness with creation and ecology?
Oh, I love that question. I do think like liberation does start with ourselves. Like, I do think that one of the best ways that we help theological liberation is also by believing in a compassionate, loveful God for ourselves. Like, when I used to work with LGBTQ folks with religious trauma, and I still do some work with that now, I would give them this exercise where I'd say, like, once a week, I want you to sit for 5 minutes and just imagine a God that loves you completely. Imagine a God that sees you completely. Because if you have religious trauma, you often are told from your church, like, you can't cherry pick God. You can't create a God in your image. And something Zerona Hurston reminds us is gods always behave like the people who make them. She's an anthropologist. And what she's highlighting is we actually are always collectively defining and redefining and renaming God. That is the work of the collective church body to say, who is God now? And the fact that God changes doesn't mean that God is not God or that God is not whatever you need God to be. The fact that God changes is just it's evolutionary. It's with us as we change as well. Something I like to highlight as a theologian is Christians used to believe slavery was biblical. Now, most Christians will not tell you, well, some people still believe this, maybe Christian nationalism, but many Christians, even maybe on the extreme side, would not say slavery itself is biblical. There's been a change in the social translation of biblical texts because there's still passages that do affirm slavery. We socially translate that text differently. So I think one, I like to remind people like we have to get to a place with ourselves where we don't believe a God that loves us fully is just a mirage or a God of our making,
Mm.
but is a real God that lives in us, that is around us, that is pleased by us, that wants to be our friend. I think we have to start with that belief for ourselves, with our own body. And then we start to get curious about how other people experience and know God. When I first realized I was queer, I called my sister and I was so like, and I told her, like, I'm going to pray this away and I'm going to live how we were taught to live. And my sister said, like, you can do that, or you can go find a bigger God. You can find a God that can receive all of you. And she said, I believe that God exists for you. And I also believe you're not a person who wants to sit at the pulpit and ask someone to fissure and fracture themselves for a small God. I believe you want to be whole and usher people into their wholeness as well. So, like I said, it starts with us believing in a loveful, compassionate God that will meet us. I found my loveful, compassionate God in the garden. Maybe you find your loveful, compassionate God in music. Maybe you find that God in art or painting or walking or something else. And then we have to start being curious about how other people experience and know God, and we
Mm.
frame that God together. Something I say all the time is liberation is a garden. We tend to God together. I can't tend my garden into bloom without you.
Mm.
Actually, even recently, I planted my summer garden with my mom, but I've been gone most of the summer. And I came back, and that garden is still in bloom. And it's not in bloom because I tended to it. It's in bloom because I planted it and she tended to it. We are both tending to God together. Our collective vision is bringing that garden to life. I think God is similar. I had a small God when I was in my church, my Pentecostal church in Sacramento, because it was mostly people of the same class background, the same political perspective. And then my God bloomed at UC Berkeley when I met people who were Buddhist, when I met people who were Sikh, when I met people who were queer, when I met people who were trans. My God grew to encompass them. Something Father Gregory Boyle says in his work is the work of defining God is building an ever expanding circle that has no one outside of those margins. And so I don't think that work is ever done, but it is the work of lifelong curiosity. I think to me that is God and that is liberation.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. You triggered some fear in me when you mentioned Father Gregory Boyle, only because
Why? Tell
uh,
me.
only only because I've been invited to speak at a conference in the UK in a few weeks, in 3 weeks,
Okay, I
that
want to talk about that.
he spoke at last year. So no pressure, Father Gregory Boyle, followed by Father Joash Thomas here. But
Uh,
uh,
what do you mean? That's a beautiful succession because
yeah,
your work is incredible. Your work
oh,
is incredible. So you like it is right in line with
uh,
your brilliance. Like that's it. That is
sure.
who you are in the company in because that is how powerful your work is as well,
No
friend.
kidding. No kidding. And like speaking of tending the garden, right? Like I mean, this is the beautiful thing about the cloud of witnesses and the saints and but it
Mm.
also colleagues like as fellow theologians, we're in different countries, we're different completely different backgrounds, unique perspectives of seeing creator God, learning from each other, but we're tending to this garden together, right? And this garden of this world that God created and
Mm.
loves so much. Um, and and we often, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, but one of my students at St. Stephen's University, teaching a class, Jesus, Justice, Empire, this summer, one of my students in that class pointed out
Very
about
cool.
um, how anthropocentric our
Ooh,
theology is.
yes.
Really challenged me.
Yeah.
My goodness. Yeah, have you wrestled with that in
You mean just
your
like how we make it human, like we make God man?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yes.
it's all about we can only have an imagination of God for humankind and not for the rest of creation. It's so narcissistically centered on humankind as a species when we have neighbors, we have brothers and sisters and siblings and nibblings in creation. Yeah.
Absolutely. I do think that God is so anthropomorphic, just period. We want God to be. It's so interesting because we talk so much about how we're made in the image of God, but we really make God in the image of us all the time. We imagine God gets angry how we get angry. We imagine God gets jealous how we place our human emotions and processes onto God, and we say that God is just like that. And what's even interesting is the Pentecostal church feels that we have a stagnant definition of God. If I said to a Pentecostal pastor, I think God evolves, they would say that's heretical. And I would say, how is that heretical to say an all knowing being evolves and changes? If we evolve and change, wouldn't that God evolve and change too? I think so. One, I think when we make God, I think we absolutely do that. And Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in her work how, through indigenous perspectives of nature, we are the little brothers and sisters of creation.
Mhm.
We have lived the least long and we have the most to learn. And there's a book I love called Lessons from Plants by Baronda Montgomery. Changed
Mm.
my life. And she's a black biochemist, but I would say her work and Alice Walker's work introduced me to ecotheology. And her book is all about what we glean about organizational well-being from plants. And she has a whole chapter just on plants and allyship, how plants, when they're next to another plant, they will do anything not to compete with that plant. They'll reach out a tendril and see, is that plant the same genus or species as me? They'll send out electric currents through the root system. They will send out gas emissions and see what that plant says back. It's doing all this communication to ask, are you my friend or are you my foe? Are you
Mm.
safe or are you not? Because plants never want to expend energy in violence when they could actually use it for collaboration. But as humans, we have made a God that is boundaried, that is
Mhm.
often violent and war centered, even when we think about the Israelites going, into the Promised Land, something Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas highlights is, but they were going into the land of the Canaanites. Someone else was also on the other side of that promise. Someone else was colonized and pillaged to bring about that promise. When we have these kind of narrow biblical stories about who is chosen and who is not, we do so much harm in the name of spiritual chosenness. But plants, even in small ways, make sure that no one is the chosen one, that they're all are in collaborative, cohesive community with one another. And I think that's so freaking cool. So I do think when God is anthropomorphic, it says, one, as humans, we are the pinnacle and paragon of wisdom. No, we are not. We actually have so much to learn, and it denies the wisdom of plant life. And even when we talk about animals, they won't feel pain. They won't feel this. Animals feel deeply. So I think we
Mm.
even so. It's so funny when we do this anthropomorphic thing. We also limit things by the limit of our human experience. And I think what we see from plants and nature is there are ways they are beyond us in intelligence and in collaborative skill. We got to learn something from them. We need those plants, you know.
Wow. Wow. That's so good. Well, this is a incredible conversation. I'm going to pause here to engage with the chat
Yes.
a little bit. And I totally agree, Sarah. Ciarra is amazing.
Thank you, friend.
Yeah, no, thank you for hanging out with us
What do you
here,
mean?
Ciarra.
This
People
is the
are
best day ever.
couldn't agree more. And then our literary agent, our shared literary agent, Morgan Strello, says she could listen to us all day.
Wait,
Nothing
can
like
I
having
got
an agent that believes in our work.
can I say actually, can I really can I give you some flowers, Father Josh, please? Okay, so, a few weeks ago, before I was signed with the amazing Morgan, I had, like, another agent, a few months ago, and I was kind of just, like, in this place of really wrestling and not knowing what was next, and when Joash heard what I was wrestling with, he was like, "I think my agent will be a good fit for you." Like, but he also said, "I feel like you are not being seen. I feel like your work is not being valued," and it just that you planted a seed in me of seeing myself so in such a new way. I mean, I talk so much about gardening and gardening being something that teaches me as a black woman, things in my life can bloom with ease. Like when you're a black queer person, you are kind of told, especially in the Pentecostal church, you're told that have no ability to bring anything in bloom, that most of your identity is sin. And you taught me to have something to say and that the right person will see that value, that I won't have to prove it. And I just thought it was normal enough to prove to my previous agent what I could say. I thought that that was like the process I had to go through to refine me, just like Patriarch of God refines us. But you introduced me to Morgan, who engages in my work and loves my work, and I love working with Morgan. And it wouldn't have happened without you believing in me. And I think like that's what being a good gardener to one another looks like. So I just want to say, Father Joash is exactly who he says he is in his work to his friends and his community. So just thank you.
No, that's very kind. That's very kind and very unnecessary, but very kind. And
No, it is so.
um,
You're awesome.
yeah, it's the least I could do to be an ally to the incredible. I mean, one, the incredibleness of who you are, but also we miss out when we don't learn from you and
Mm,
your unique vantage points from creation,
mm,
uh, and we miss out when we also don't learn from creation and
mm.
ecotheology, right? And so, so here's something I've been toying with, and I don't have a lot of friends who I can nerd out about this stuff with. So I want to pick your brain on this a little bit. I've been like just chewing a little bit on. We talked about invasive species a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, I have so
I'm
many
gonna
thoughts.
go there.
I have so many thoughts on this. Please. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so can you like as the gardening theologian tell us what invasive species are, and then I'll ask my question.
Yes, yes, yes. So an invasive species one and then also Cass, I saw you had a comment. I'll try to get to it at the
Oh
end if I see it.
yes,
But, invasive species are plants that usurp their environment. I see them as I call them like colonial agents of colonialism in an environment. That's really how I see them. But what's
please.
interesting is invasive species are pretty much I maybe there are circumstances in which they don't. If there's any, ecologists in here, let me know if I'm wrong. But my understanding is they're always introduced through human intervention, almost always. And they've often been a result of colonial violence, people moving to new places, taking like white colonial violence. They're up in Africa, they bring this plant back to the United States. The United States, they bring this plant to the Caribbean and wreaking ecological havoc through colonial violence is how I kind of see invasive species, but they really choke out the resources of that area. But I want to say it's not the plant itself that necessarily is invasive. We made that plant invasive by bringing it to that space. Like we're saying the species is invasive, but the process was us. We were the invasive species, in
Yes.
that beginning. That's how I see it.
Wow. Wow. So good. So good. Yeah, I do want to go to Cass's comment, and then we'll continue the
Oh, we're gonna
conversation
talk
on
about invasive
invasive
species. I have
species.
thoughts on that.
1000%. Cass says, "How do we attach the sense of self and God in the day-to-day work that we do as regular humans?
Mm.
So many are striving just to survive, let alone see God regularly." What
Oh,
would you say,
I
preacher?
I love that, and I mentioned Buddhist meditation a lot. I think Buddhism was like a bridge when I first deconstructed, I was atheist for a while, and, like, even though I was studying in theology school, I think I couldn't connect with God. I had, like, decolonized, deconstructed into, like, nihilism, I guess, maybe. I don't wanna say atheism is nihilism because I think atheism is lit, actually. Um, but Buddhism was my bridge back to God in some ways because
Mm,
I needed to, like, almost, I have fibromyalgia, which is autoimmune condition, and to heal fibromyalgia, you do something called neuromuscular desensitization,
mm,
where you teach your brain that sites of pain are not dangerous. So when you have fibromyalgia, it's hard to work out because your body feels too much pain, it gets inflamed. And one way you heal it is to like work out 5 minutes a day, then work out 7 minutes a day. It's the slow reconnection with the divine. And Buddhism did that for me. It was just like a 1 minute meditation, a 2 minute meditation, a 3 minute contemplative practice trying to get back into seeing my body as good and connecting to the universe. So I think
wow.
for that question, I think a simple practice of connecting to compassion every day, whether it's a 2 minute journal exercise where you just stay in compassionate contemplation and say positive things about yourself, project positivity into your day, whether it's 1 minute walking with your coffee up and down the block for a moment, finding these gentle ways to reset. I think when we grew up Pentecostal or religious, we think our moments of prayer or contemplation need to be big shows. They just need to be private and quiet and connected. And that can
Mhm.
look a million ways. So I would say make it simple, make it easy, and make it gentle. And that can look a bajillion ways.
That's so beautiful. That's so good.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is, again, something we've been talking about this whole time, which is One of the greatest lies of empire is that we're alone.
Mm.
Um,
Oh my gosh. Woo.
and because it divides us, it needs to divide us, right? And um, it needs to divide us to conquer us. So, so there's something really there to reminding ourselves that we're not alone, that we're in
Mm.
this great cloud of witnesses,
Oh, I had that.
not just among humankind and heroes of the faith, but also um, great cloud of witnesses in creation. Um, like you said, we're the younger beings in this world, right? And so, how do we learn from the rest of creation, and again, see our not just survival, but also our liberation as tied to the liberation of our ecology
Mm.
from empire, because it
Oh.
is.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm gonna answer your invasive species question, and I'm gonna answer this question both here because I wanna make sure
Yeah,
I do both those. And I think it ties into empire and doing this work together and not being alone. But I think one in our churches, I would say if we take the idea of invasive species, how it usurps an environment, many of our churches are framed by invasive theology. Only patriarchal theology defines our church, or only meaning it's very like my church is very almost masculine in its faith. We were told we were soldiers for God, and our job was to go out there and be warriors for God and to evangelize everyone into our point of view. Like that's patriarchal and colonial. It's invasive, and it's even saying I hold the keys of all knowledge and you got to have this knowledge too, or you're not saved. Like that's not very much, as you mentioned, interdependent. And I think
mm,
in many ways, Pentecostalism is built upon this meritocracy based theology. I've shown God I'm good enough. Now I'll give you the keys. So you can show God you're good enough, and you can teach the next person to be good enough. But we're not in relationship. We're in a learned performance of faith, in my opinion. But when I think about this interdependence, I think about how, as I mentioned, one, our theologies necessitate one another's perspective. I know God more from knowing you. But we could even go back to gardens as an example. Nothing blooms alone. Like one thing that's so great about a garden, and I think it's good for those who are deconstructing, is that garden also requires you. It requires you for it to bloom, but it requires other things too. Like I had my garden once and my squash were not blooming, and I was so mad at my squash. Like I don't know, I was like mad at them. Like every day I was just going out there just looking at them, disapproving, like disapproving God, just like looking at the squash. And then one day I did a bunch of research and I realized my squash had way too many leaves, which meant that
mm,
bees couldn't get to the central flowers to pollinate. And so the issue of this squash not thriving had nothing to do with itself. It had to do with me as a gardener tending to and creating pathways for collaboration. All I needed was a little pruning. Then the bees and the squash get to do their thing together. But the interdependence was me not blaming that squash for failing, but creating the conditions for its thriving. And that's all of us. In the Pentecostal church, we often, blame the woman who's pregnant out of wedlock because we see that as sin, or we blame the queer person for being queer because how dare they be in sin? Instead of saying, does our theology need to expand to embrace that pregnant woman? Does our theology need to expand so this queer person doesn't experience being themselves as suffering? I think we often say suffer to get back into the fold, suffer independently for us, suffer so we can see your faith. But what I learned from that squash, I like to call it the squash problem. What I learned from having the squash problem is nothing blooms alone. And in fact, the best ways that we create thriving is to say thriving necessitates interdependence. As I mentioned with getting to sign with the bindery, I would not have my agent if I didn't have friendship with Father Joash. It's an interdependent relationship, and like how beautiful that it is. So there's nothing good in my life that has come without interdependence, without saying, "Hey, can you help me? Hey, can you give me a new perspective?" I think we all need that.
wow, wow, what a learning to learn at the feet of sister creation, right there. My goodness.
Oh,
Um,
she be teaching us.
No, yeah, no kidding, no kidding. So uh, here's a theory, thought, question on invasive species. I wanted to run by you, and it only hit me
Give
on
it
this
to me.
backcountry camping trip I was on. Once I got over my fears of bears.
I'm so impressed. Again, like that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, yeah. It took me a whole day and a night to get over the fear of the other, and ultimately realizing I was otherizing
Mm,
brother bear, sister bear, as Saint
mm.
Francis would, acknowledge in siblings and creation, and realizing that, yeah, I'm a guest on brother sister bear's land here, and um, brother sister bear probably has a lot of trauma from my species, and
Mm.
it's understandable if wants to come at me and give me a bear hug. Um, but 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 once I was able to empathize, I feel like with the imaginary bear out there, I was able to then be a better student of creation. And once I was able to get over this fear of otherizing, by empathizing, I was able to be at one, and commune with God in creation. And but
Wow.
that's just a distraction from
No,
my
it's not. That's
backcountry camping.
no. You're like, "I was still afraid, but I had this moment of transcendence."
Yes, yes, there it is, there it is. Yep. So once I got over that fear and processed all that with Celtic and Franciscan theology, um, what was what struck me was just this thought about invasive species, right?
Mm.
And I love how you defined it as it's human intervention that allows this to be invasive in the first place. Like this species has of plant has nothing to do. It has no business being on Turtle Island, but colonizers and settlers coming with colonialism brought their favorite invasive species and brought it here, and it also colonized the ecosystem around us, right, by harming life. And my the thing I was wondering was, so that going back to the human intervention aspect that you brought up so beautifully, um, so clearly we intervened as human beings by bringing these plants here. But did these plants actually learn to be invasive
Mm.
from us as settlers? And by us, I mean, settler colonial folks. Like, did these human beings unintentionally teach these plants something that they learned from them to then go be colonizing and invasive? And the way I was wondering
Oh.
that worked was, um, um, if, just given the fact that, again, we breathe out CO2, the plants breathe in our CO2, and then we breathe in the plant's
Oxygen,
oxygen,
yeah.
right? So even us, like even humankind in Europe, coexisting with their species, like was there a level of just by breath being exchanged,
Mm.
teaching of colonial ways that then, you know, the plants came here with their colonial masters and knew exactly what to do, colonize
Mm.
species. I don't know. These are very
Oh, I
up
love
in the
this
air thoughts, but
question.
I'd love to hear.
And I wish that I even knew I wish I had all the scientific answers here, I don't. But I
Yeah.
do think, well, one thing I did learn, I mean, especially
I
from
swear I
lessons.
wasn't on
No,
psychedelics or
no.
anything.
First
I
of all,
wasn't
no,
tripping.
I know, I think no, these are like such theologian thoughts. Like, I didn't think you were like, this is just the
Just-
natural high of being a theologian, truly. And the existential drama of it too.
There you go.
But I think no, I think it's so funny because as you were talking, one thing I had thought about, which I don't know, is
Yeah.
when plants are being invasive, are they in pain? Was a thought I had actually as you were asking that, because the one thing I did learn from lessons from plants is how much plants purposefully are boundaried. For example,
Mm,
even if you look at like if you're walking under like in a rainforest and you look up, you'll see that plants have boundaries on purpose with another tree. They don't touch another tree's leaf because they want to live expansively and fully. And we see that plants do experience pain, that plants do have memory. I talk a lot about in my work agave plants and their death blooming process, which I'll get to in a second. But I
mm,
do, from what I have studied and understand, plants want to be harmonious. And
mm,
so I think whether we teach this planet by putting it in an environment in which it cannot stop its growth, or because it's witnessed our own colonial violence and experienced it, I do think we are training plants to behave in ways outside of their nature. That in its natural system, this plant would never behave this way. So I don't know if it's from witnessing, like I mentioned, or just the environmental stress. But I mentioned death blooming because death blooming is a natural process of death, so I'll get there in 1 second. But we see plants do another thing when they're under stress, which is bolting. They prematurely will release seeds. They'll prematurely die as a way to ensure their next life cycle because they are stressed. So we see overall plants do respond to stress in their environment. They do change their behavior when under duress, just like us. Just like we can argue that autoimmune conditions come through chronic environmental stress, which is why we see them in Black women. We are teaching them to behave outside of their nature. I can't say all the catalysts for that. Um, but then I think in death blooming, we see like the positive end to a plant's life. Agave plants after like 50 years, well, ours lived 25 years. They they form like this 80-foot tree where like it is gorgeous and they die through this tree, this like kind of display. And I think there we see like when they're in their best natural system, plants live this beautiful cycle. And even death within plants is like a moment of celebration and change. But I think
Mm.
we steal all of that process from plants when we put them under duress and stress. But again, I can't speak to all the science there. I don't want to overstep in my
My
ecological
goodness.
knowledge. But
No, that's good. That's good. And this is why we're theologians. You know, sometimes we operate out of the
we're,
bounds.
we're making
Science.
meaning. Okay, we're making.
That's exactly it. Um, Ciarra, before I ask you to share where folks can find you and your work,
Yeah.
I want to invite folks listening. If you have a question, only because we haven't done this so far, if you have a question for Ciarra, do drop that in the chat, please.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
But as you know, as folks are maybe typing that in, and um, I just want to say, if this is your first time coming across Ciarra and you don't subscribe to her Substack, please do. That is my only ask from this conversation, and of course, be a paid subscriber to her as well, and support
That's really
Ciarra's
nice.
work. And of course, like you mentioned, you have a literary agent, so Kat's a little out of the bag there. So tell us a
But
little bit. No, I'm just kidding.
it's
No,
your
no,
agent.
no. No.
Morgan's
Tell
yours,
us,
ain't you?
where folks can find you, your work, and of course, like I think people should be tracking with you because you may have a book coming out, right? So,
Morgan, help
anything you want to
me.
tease?
Help me, Sister Morgan. Um, one, I just want to like before I say anything about myself, like I said, I just like I cannot I feel emotional because I just think you were such a wonderful person, and I feel so lucky to be in your orbit. I learned more about myself today. I want a chance to ask you I have so many things to ask you. Like I feel like I talk too much and I didn't get to hear enough of you and your wisdom. So I can't wait to
That's
have you
what today was
on
for.
my podcast and learn from you. So anyway, I just really, really have so much appreciation for you. And I hope we can have some. I'm gonna be sending you some stuff. We're gonna do a little eco-theology joint post or something. But you can find me on Instagram at the Gardening Theologian. You can find me on TikTok at the Gardening Theologian. And then I also have a page for like anti-racist deconstruction education called Ciarra Jones Consulting. That's where you'll find like a lot of my podcast clips with a lot of my expert friends and all that. So please do connect, whether you can connect for free, whether you can connect paid. Like I'm so honored to be in community with you. I always say like as a Black queer person, I was told no one would ever care anything I had to say about God. So I'm always grateful when one person wants to sit with me and I can learn about God from them and they'll learn about God from me. Like every day is a miracle for me in the work I get to do because I was told I'd never get to do it. So I'm just really grateful every day.
Well, to use Pentecostal language, that's a lie from the pit of hell, and I'm glad you don't believe it, because
Rebuking it.
yes, we're gonna rebuke it in Jesus' name. I'm a priest. I'll do that for us. A
Thank you.
little bit of exorcism from the demons of our evangelical past. But
Oh,
Ciarra, thank you so much for that wisdom. And a closing question, perfect question from David here. Any book on
yes.
ecotheology that you'd recommend beyond the ones you've name dropped, or you can name drop them again?
Yes. Church in the Wild is amazing. And I just started Eco Womanism. Oh, that's a really good one. And then I actually have to go to my Google because I just
Yes.
picked up another one and I got to look at my Kindle. All my books are on my Kindle. So let me see. Oh, Thus Spoke the Plant. I just bought that and I haven't really read it. But I'm really excited. Yeah, Church of the Wild, Lessons from Plants. I do think In Search of Our Mother's Garden by Alice Walker, and also reread The Color Purple, y'all. Like The Color Purple is phenomenal. Braiding Sweetgrass, and there's one more. I think the guy's name is Jeffrey. Let me find. He is it. Maybe you'll know it, Father Joash. He was a theologian that then went and like lived on like a Good Soil, Jeff Chu. I just bought that. I haven't read it, but it's all about a theologian who like went to go work on a farm and all he learned from that. So I'm really excited. So those are all the books I recommend in this. That's About the Plant, Good Soil, Church in the Wild, Braiding Sweetgrass, Eco Womanism, and In Search of Our Mother's Garden. Those are uh, you'll have a field day with those books.
Thank you for that. That's so wise. Do you have a couple of minutes? Only because we had one more question here.
I can answer one question, then I
One
will have to
question.
kind of hop fast
Yes,
because I have a
we will.
six. But
Absolutely. Yeah, and what you can even keep
no,
this
I'm gonna
brief
answer
for
and
our
then
audience.
but
Please.
I wanna be I shouldn't have scheduled it back to back because
No,
I'm
no, no,
excited about
no. You're
it.
good.
Appreciate respected. Would love to learn about flourishing in community. When Ciarra was speaking, I thought of how people often romanticize the rose that grew from concrete. Oh man, I have so many thoughts. When we were at as I mentioned, when we were at the retreat, I was suffering in some not great professional environments for myself,
Yeah.
but I thought that that was a sharpening of myself or remaking me or all the things my Pentecostal church taught me about suffering. And I actually just left this today is my last day of a job that I did not really love. So I'm really excited. And I also
Liberation. Yeah.
liberation, but also today I got to send in a great consulting proposal. So feeling good. And I named that to say when we were at the retreat, Dr. Tama Bryant was there, which was the greatest gift of my life. And I told her, like, girl, I'm suffering, but I feel like God is calling me to suffer. And she was like, oh no, God is never calling us to suffer.
Yeah.
And like that was so helpful. And she said, like, the things that are for us doesn't mean that we won't have hardship in them, but I think there are ways we do normalize suffering in community by saying like we all need to suffer. And I just don't believe that. I think that when we have people in our community, whether that's work, whether that's church, whether that's somewhere else and they're suffering, then we need to ask what needs to change in the structure of this community? What needs to change in the structure of this relationship so we're
Mm.
whole together? I truly do believe in a world where no one is suffering, but I think that and maybe Buddhists would tell me that that's wrong because suffering is Buddhism teaches us suffering is everyone will experience suffering, but I think that's because we live in a world steeped in inequality. So
Mm.
something I will say is I just think that when we're in community and someone is suffering, it doesn't mean that they need to continue suffering. It means something needs to change in that structure. Like imagine you're in a romantic relationship and your partner says, when we communicate this way, I feel small. You wouldn't continue to communicate that way. You'd say, how do we compromise on communication so we both feel whole? I think that's what community does for us. There's no
Yeah.
world in which a suffering plant blooms, or as I mentioned, it'll die early. So as a gardener, I want to say, how do I decrease suffering so blooming and thriving can happen?
Wow. Well, thank you for that wisdom, and thank you for all your wisdom and your generosity and time,
Of
Ciarra.
course.
Really appreciate you. And folks, thank you for joining us. We'll continue the conversation some other time. Blessings, Ciarra.
Thanks,
Blessings,
folks. See you guys
everyone.
later. Sorry I have to run, but I'll see you guys later.
No.